June 1943. The sun burned down on a line of German prisoners of war as their train pulled into a small town in Texas. Dust rose with every step as guards ordered them to disembark. The men were hollow-eyed from weeks of defeat, still carrying the bitterness of the desert campaigns where food had been harder to find than ammunition. In their minds, America was supposed to be weak, decadent, collapsing under the strain of war. Nazi propaganda had promised them that. Yet as they stepped off the platform, the first thing that struck them was not the sound of guards shouting or the glare of rifles. It was the smell. A warm, heavy scent drifting from the town's diner nearby, something thick with fat and smoke. Meat. The prisoners turned their heads instinctively. Through a wide diner window, they saw American workers in overalls sitting casually at a long counter, eating sandwiches stuffed so thick with beef that the bread seemed only decoration. One man chewed halfway through his sandwich, wiped his hands, and tossed the rest into a bin before ordering another. The German prisoners froze. Not one word was spoken, but the meaning was clear on every face. For men who had marched across Africa fighting for every crust of bread and every scrap of horse meat, the sight of Americans throwing away beef was beyond comprehension. One officer scribbled later in his hidden diary that in that single moment he realized something had broken inside him. In North Africa, his company had been rationed to 200 grams of meat a week. The taste of real beef had become a fading memory. They had boiled turnips until the water turned gray, gnawed at stale black bread, dreamed of sausage that never came. But here, in the heart of the enemy's land, ordinary workers treated meat not as a treasure, not as a holiday luxury, but as something cheaper than bread. They ate it quickly, without reverence, without hesitation, and discarded it as though it were nothing. For the captured Germans, it was not just hunger that stabbed at their stomachs. It was a revelation. Everything they had believed about America was being torn apart before their eyes. They had imagined a nation too divided to fight, a people too soft to endure hardship. Yet here was proof of a different truth. The United States was not starving. The United States was not rationing the way Germany did. The United States was producing so much that even waste became normal. In that moment, staring through a diner window at a half-eaten sandwich of beef thicker than their weekly ration, the German prisoners felt the first tremor of despair. The war, they realized, might already be lost, not on the battlefield of Africa, but in the kitchens and farms of America. They could fight with rifles and tanks and courage, but no amount of sacrifice could match a nation that ate meat like bread. The prisoners shuffled forward under the watch of their guards, but their eyes kept straying back to the town around them. Every shop window seemed alive with light, every grocery stacked with goods. A butcher's display caught their attention. Behind the glass lay rows of steaks, pork chops, hams, and sausages, so plentiful it looked like a harvest festival. Housewives carried shopping bags filled with meat wrapped in white paper. Children licked ice cream cones as if sugar and cream were inexhaustible. For the Germans, who had lived through years of rationing and scarcity, it was not just strange, it was impossible. In their homeland, meat was measured in grams, sugar was locked away and divided by stamps, butter had disappeared entirely. Yet here, in the middle of a war, America seemed untouched by hunger. One prisoner, a farmer's son from Bavaria, tried to make sense of it. He remembered his village back home, where families had slaughtered a single pig and stretched its meat through the winter, boiling every bone for soup. In Africa, he had seen comrades chew strips of dried horseflesh to keep themselves alive. Now, in Texas, he saw a boy bite once into a hot dog, grow bored, and throw the rest to the ground, where a dog snatched it up. He whispered to the man beside him, "Do you see this? They give meat to animals." The words carried the weight of disbelief. As they were marched toward the waiting trucks that would take them to the camps, the Germans passed a line of restaurants. From open doors came the clatter of dishes and the rich smell of frying bacon. They watched as American workers paid a few cents for meals that would have cost a German officer an entire week's salary. If such food could even be found. The guards did not explain, and they did not need to. The contrast explained itself. To these prisoners, The war had always been about survival through sacrifice. To the Americans, it seemed, the war was being fought without surrendering comfort. In the silence of that march, each man began to calculate in his own mind. If civilians ate like kings, what then did American soldiers receive at the front? If restaurants in small towns brimmed with beef and butter, what scale of production stood behind them? The Germans had grown up believing war was decided by generals, by tanks and aircraft, by bravery on the battlefield. Yet in Texas, a new reality was dawning. War could be decided by farms that yielded enough beef to feed millions, by factories that canned meat faster than armies could consume it, by trains that carried endless supplies from one side of a continent to the other. One prisoner wrote later that the march through that town was the first time he understood the futility of the struggle. Not because of the rifles at their backs or the shame of surrender, but because he saw with his own eyes a society so abundant it could afford to waste what his countrymen killed for. He described the feeling as a slow suffocation, as though the realization pressed against his chest harder than any enemy weapon. America's strength, he concluded, was not in its armies alone, but in the simple fact that its people ate meat like bread. By the time the trucks rumbled out of town, the prisoners sat in silence, their thoughts heavier than the chains on their wrists. They passed fields that seemed to stretch without end, pastures dotted with hundreds of cattle grazing lazily under the Texas Sunday. To German eyes, each animal represented more meat than their families would see in months, yet here they were in the thousands, unguarded, as if they were inexhaustible. The sight gnawed at their pride. In Germany, farmers guarded every animal as if it were gold, rationing milk by the cup, stretching lard until it was translucent on black bread. In Texas, abundance looked ordinary. One of the prisoners, once a supply officer in the Africa Corps, began to add the numbers in his head. He had spent months calculating rations for an entire regiment, always dividing scarcity, never enough to satisfy the men. Now he tried to imagine calculating for America. How many cattle in one field? How many fields across one state? How many states across the nation? The totals spiraled out of control. The United States had more beef on the hoof than Germany could ever dream of slaughtering. He understood, with the cold certainty of a man who knows numbers better than words, that logistics alone had already decided the war. At a crossroads, the trucks halted, waiting for a freight train to pass. The prisoners stared as boxcars thundered by, each marked with the words Swift or Armor, the great meatpacking companies of Chicago. Open slats revealed blocks of ice stacked beside crates of beef, pork, and poultry. The convoy seemed endless, dozens of cars, hundreds of tons of food racing toward some unseen front. One prisoner muttered, "That train alone carries more meat than the Africa Corps ate in a year." No one contradicted him. They all knew it was true. When the trucks finally rolled into the gates of the camp, the prisoners braced for harsh conditions. Instead, they were stunned again. Wooden barracks with electric lights, hot water, and kitchens that smelled of roasting beef awaited them. The evening meal was served in metal trays: roast meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and coffee, strong enough to sting their throats. For the first time in years, some of them left food uneaten because they were too full. The guards collected the scraps and tossed them into garbage bins, already half filled with leftovers. The prisoners stared at the waste in disbelief. It was not just the quantity of food that shocked them, but the casualness with which it was discarded. That night, as the barracks settled into uneasy quiet, one prisoner lay awake, replaying the day's images in his mind: the diner window, the butcher's shop, the endless fields of cattle, the train of refrigerated cars, the trays of food, the scraps thrown away. He thought of his wife back in Hamburg, standing in line for hours with ration coupons to receive a thin slice of horse meat or a loaf of bread made with sawdust filler. He thought of his children, their ribs pressing against skin, their eyes hollow from hunger. And then he thought of the Americans, eating beef like bread, tossing meat to dogs, throwing away what Germany starved for. His heart tightened. He realized this was more than defeat on the battlefield. This was the collapse of everything he had believed about German superiority. The war was already lost, not because of courage or tactics, but because one side had oceans of food while the other fought over crumbs. Before the desert defeat, before the journey across the Atlantic, these men had lived through a different war. In the North African campaign, food was not a ration, it was a weapon. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of sand where every convoy risked British bombers and American fighters. Meat, when it arrived, was salted or canned, often already spoiled by the sun before it reached the front. Soldiers wrote in their diaries that they fought over tins of corned beef more fiercely than over medals. One corporal described boiling boots to soften the leather into something chewable. By 1942, most Afrika Korps soldiers received no more than 200 grams of meat per week. Their rations consisted mainly of black bread baked from rye and barley fillers, turnip soup, and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted acorns. The contrast with their American enemies could not have been greater. When the United States entered the war, it mobilized its farms as ruthlessly as its factories. The War Food Administration coordinated livestock markets, refrigeration plants, and canneries on a scale the Germans could hardly imagine. By 1943, American soldiers carried sea rations that contained 12 tins of meat and beans, biscuits, powdered coffee, sugar, and chocolate. Each individual ration pack provided more calories than a German platoon might see in a day. The Americans fought with bellies full, their packs heavy with chocolate bars and chewing gum, luxuries the Germans had not seen in years. A German officer captured at El Alamein later wrote in his secret notes that his men were physically beaten before the battle even began. The British had tea, the Americans had chocolate, we had hunger. He described how the men would line up for watery turnip stew and divide the rare scraps of beef into pieces so small they were almost symbolic. Many soldiers developed dysentery from spoiled food, their bodies weakened not just by combat but by malnutrition. Every rifle shot was accompanied by the gnawing ache of empty stomachs. In the desert, the disparity became undeniable. American camps were discovered with refrigerators powered by portable generators, stocked with cuts of beef wrapped in wax paper. German troops raided these camps whenever possible, sometimes risking firefights simply to grab rations. Prisoners taken in those raids admitted later that the sight of Americans casually eating meat 3 times a day broke their morale more than artillery barrages. They had grown up believing Germans were tougher, harder, capable of enduring privation. Yet what they encountered was an enemy who could fight just as hard while never knowing hunger. One prisoner, once a logistics officer, calculated during the desert retreat that American supply ships carried more meat in one convoy than the Afrika Korps had received in an entire year. He confessed that when he saw American soldiers throwing away bacon ends or feeding sausage to camp dogs, he realized Germany could never match such wealth. In the words he wrote years later, "We were trying to win a war with hunger against a nation that fought with abundance. It was impossible." By the time these soldiers were captured in Tunisia in 1943, they had already learned despair from hunger. They surrendered not just to enemy soldiers, but to the arithmetic of supply. They marched into captivity with their stomachs empty and their spirits hollow, prepared for worse conditions. What none of them expected was that captivity would feed them better than freedom had. The capture in Tunisia was only the beginning of their transformation. After surrendering, thousands of German and Italian prisoners were herded into makeshift desert camps, fenced with barbed wire under the pitiless African Sunday. They waited days, then weeks, for transport. Rumors spread through the cages. They would be shipped to Britain, maybe to Canada, perhaps even to America itself. Most dismissed the idea as absurd. Nazi propaganda had insisted that the United States was collapsing under strikes and racial violence, incapable of feeding its own population. How could such a nation transport and house hundreds of thousands of prisoners? When the Liberty ships finally arrived, the truth began to crack their illusions. The vessels themselves were monuments to American industry. The Germans quickly learned, from talkative guards and crew, that one such ship could be built in less than a week. They scoffed at first, claiming it was a lie, until they saw the details, the clean steel plates, the fresh paint, the still new equipment. These were not old freighters pressed into service. They were fresh off the assembly line, proof that America could churn out cargo ships faster than the Reich could sink them. On board, the prisoners were stunned by the conditions. They expected filthy holds and starvation rations, but instead were quartered in makeshift bunks with regular meals. 3 times a day they were fed white bread, meat, vegetables, even coffee. The ship's kitchen worked constantly, producing food in quantities unimaginable to men who had spent years counting each crust of bread. Many POWs described their first American meal at sea as surreal. Beef stew thick with chunks of meat, fresh fruit, and real coffee with sugar. For soldiers who had been living on turnip soup, it was a revelation. The real shock came not from what they were given, but from what was thrown away. On deck, German eyes watched in disbelief as American sailors scraped entire plates of uneaten food into the sea. Half-eaten steaks, loaves of bread still soft, cups of milk poured over the side without thought. The sailors laughed, smoked cigarettes, and carried on, unconcerned. For the prisoners, every splash of wasted food was a wound. One prisoner later wrote, "In that moment, I realized we had lost the war. We were fighting men who could waste what we would die to obtain." They began to see the larger machinery behind this abundance. Liberty ships like the one they sailed on were only a fraction of America's logistical power. At peak production, the United States launched 3 such vessels per day. Each required over 250,000 individual parts, manufactured in dozens of states, assembled in shipyards that had barely existed 2 years before. To the German soldiers, trained in a country where shortages plagued every industry, the scale was incomprehensible. One officer noted bitterly that while Germany struggled to repair a single Panzer Division's fuel trucks, America was mass-producing ships faster than storms could rust them. The voyage across the Atlantic took 2 weeks. During that time, the prisoners ate better than they had in years. Some gained weight. Some became sick from the sudden change in diet, their bodies unaccustomed to so much fat and protein. Yet what marked them most was the constant reminder of waste. Buckets of scraps were poured overboard daily, enough, they calculated, to feed an entire German company. Bread was so plentiful that guards used it to clean grease from their hands before tossing it aside. The message was unspoken but clear. America's strength was not just in weapons, but in its ability to drown its enemies in food. As the convoy neared the American coast, the prisoners crowded the rails. At night, they saw something that shocked them even more deeply than the food: light. The shoreline glittered with electric illumination stretching across the horizon, an endless chain of glowing cities. In Germany, blackout orders had plunged the nation into darkness since 1940. Here, in wartime, America still blazed with light. For the first time, many prisoners understood that the enemy they had been taught to despise was not struggling to survive. America was thriving. When the ships docked in Norfolk, Virginia, the final illusion collapsed. The harbor stretched for miles, filled with cranes, freighters, warships, and warehouses. In a single day, more cargo was unloaded than the port of Hamburg managed in a week. The prisoners stared silently as trucks rolled past, loaded with crates of meat, barrels of oil, and mountains of supplies. They had been captured as soldiers of a supposedly superior race, fighting for a cause of destiny. Now they stood on American soil, confronted with a truth more devastating than defeat in battle. America's power was not myth. It was reality, and they were about to experience it every day in captivity. The journey inland took days. From Norfolk, the prisoners were loaded onto passenger trains, Pullman coaches with cushioned seats, not cattle wagons. Guards apologized when the air conditioning faltered, as though enemies deserved comfort. At night, the Germans pressed their faces to the windows and saw towns glowing with light, every farmhouse and every street illuminated. For men who had lived years under blackout curtains, it was a surreal landscape. But nothing prepared them for Texas. When the train finally slowed in the small town near their destination, the air was thick with the smell of cooking. Women in cotton dresses waved from porches, children ran barefoot, and the scent of roasting beef drifted across the tracks. The prisoners were marched to waiting trucks and carried through wide streets where shop windows overflowed with goods. At a butcher's shop, sides of beef hung in the window, gleaming red, while ordinary citizens bought meat with little more than pocket change. To the prisoners, still haunted by ration cards and hunger lines, the sight felt like an insult from another world. At last, they arrived at the camp. The gates swung open to reveal rows of wooden barracks, each fitted with electric lights, stoves, and even hot showers. Some men muttered that it was a trick, a temporary display meant to soften their resistance, but the guards treated it as routine. They were led into a vast mess hall where long tables stood ready, trays stacked high. Then came the shock that would remain burned into their memories: the first meal. Each tray held slices of roast beef, steaming potatoes, bread as white as snow, butter, vegetables, and coffee rich with sugar and cream. To men who had survived on 200 grams of meat per week, this was not food. It was abundance beyond comprehension. They ate quickly, desperately, as though the food might vanish if not consumed immediately. Some grew sick from the sudden flood of fat and protein, but most kept eating until their trays were clean. Then they saw what happened to the leftovers. Guards collected half-eaten portions and tossed them into garbage bins already overflowing with scraps. Perfectly good bread, meat, and vegetables thrown away because they were simply not needed. The Germans sat in stunned silence. One whispered, "Back home, my wife waits hours for a half loaf of bread. Here they throw away loaves." Another shook his head. "We fought for Tunisia, for every liter of gasoline, every tin of meat. And here they bury meat in trash." A doctor among them realized something even darker. If prisoners were fed this well, then American soldiers must be receiving even more. The front lines, he thought, must be supplied not with the bare minimum, but with excess, mountains of food and fuel flowing endlessly. That evening, in the barracks, the men whispered about what they had seen. Some insisted it was propaganda designed to break their spirits. Others, recalling the endless lights of the towns, the trains full of cattle, the harbor crammed with ships, argued that it was too vast to fake. One veteran of the Eastern Front said quietly, "If they feed prisoners like this, then we are finished. They can afford to waste more than we can produce." The words hung heavy in the humid night. Days turned to weeks, and the abundance became routine. Each morning began with eggs, bacon, and milk. At midday, sandwiches with meat thick enough to shame German officers' banquets. At night, hearty dinners that civilians in Berlin had not tasted in years. The prisoners tried to hide their astonishment, but in private, they recorded their despair. Diaries smuggled through the camps are filled with the same refrain: "We are living better in captivity than our families live in freedom." The psychological weight grew heavier. Back home, letters from wives and mothers described ration cards, shortages, hunger biting into daily life. Children were losing weight, elderly parents were fainting in bread lines, and entire neighborhoods survived on soup kitchens. Yet here, thousands of miles away, their captors piled food onto prisoners' plates and threw the excess into bins without a thought. It was not cruelty. It was indifference born of unimaginable wealth. For many Germans, that realization was the sharpest wound. They had believed in sacrifice, in the myth that hardship proved strength. But what they saw in Texas was a different kind of strength. A nation so wealthy that even its enemies lived in abundance. And slowly, silently, they began to understand. The war was not going to be decided by bravery or tactics. It was already decided by production, by farms that could raise endless cattle, by factories that could can mountains of meat, by trains and ships that carried food across oceans without pause. One prisoner summed it up in his diary: "We dreamed of bread, they throw away meat. That is why we lost." Work details soon followed. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be employed in non-military labor, and America had a shortage of farmhands with so many young men overseas. Trucks carried groups of Germans out of the camps and into the Texas countryside. What they saw there erased the last fragments of Nazi propaganda that still clung to their minds. The land seemed endless. Mile after mile of pasture stretched to the horizon, dotted with herds of cattle so vast they looked like dark rivers flowing across the grass. In Bavaria or Saxony, a family might raise 2 or 3 cows, guarded and fed with care through long winters. Here, one farm had hundreds. The men gaped silently as American farmers waved casually from tractors, machines larger than anything they had ever seen in Germany. A 16-year-old boy drove one machine worth more, a prisoner calculated bitterly, than his father had earned in a lifetime. The Germans were assigned to basic tasks, mending fences, clearing brush, helping with feed. They were astonished by the efficiency. Cattle were fed by conveyor systems that carried grain directly to troughs. Water was pumped by electric engines that never faltered. Trucks hauled bales of hay with speed no horse-drawn cart could match. Everywhere they turned, machines replaced men. What 100 German laborers might do in a week, one American farmer managed in a single day. At midday, the prisoners were given lunch alongside farmhands. Thick sandwiches piled with beef, cold milk straight from chilled bottles, apples and oranges as if they grew from air. A German corporal stared at his plate and whispered, "This is more than we ate in a week on the front." His companion pointed at the cattle grazing lazily in the field and added, "Each one of those animals is a week of rations for a whole company." The numbers were crushing. In Germany, a year's ration of meat per civilian had fallen below 30 pounds by 1944. In America, the average was 5 times higher. The real revelation came when prisoners were shown the slaughterhouses. Herds driven into massive facilities, dispatched with mechanical precision, processed by assembly lines that turned living animals into steaks, roasts, sausages, and canned meat within hours. One prisoner, who had worked in a small butcher's shop in Hamburg before the war, nearly wept at the sight. He later wrote, "What 10 men with knives and cleavers might do in a day, these machines did in minutes." And there were dozens of such plants across Texas alone. They began to grasp the scale. American meat production was not measured by villages or provinces, but by states, each larger than all of Germany. The United States produced more beef than the entire Axis combined. Spam, the canned meat sent to soldiers across the globe, was produced in billions of tins, 5 billion pounds during the war years. To German soldiers who had fought and starved in Africa, the realization was unbearable. They had been trying to conquer a world power while their enemy fed its armies with food so abundant it spilled from warehouses. The humiliation deepened when they noticed that even the farm animals seemed better nourished than German civilians. American cows were thick and heavy, bred for beef and milk, while cattle in Germany had grown gaunt from fodder shortages. Horses in America were well-fed and strong, while German families were slaughtering theirs for food. One prisoner confessed to a guard in broken English, "Your cows eat better than my children." The guard did not reply. He only looked away, embarrassed, as if abundance was too ordinary to be worth explaining. That night, back in the camp, the prisoners could not sleep. They whispered about the farms, about the boy on the tractor, about the slaughterhouse that could feed an army in a day. Some tried to deny it, claiming what they saw was an exception, a special farm chosen to impress them. But others, more observant, shook their heads. "No," one said quietly. "This is everywhere. They have so much they don't even notice it. We have lost, not because we fought poorly, but because we fought hunger against a land of plenty." In the diary of one prisoner, a single line captured the despair that had settled over them. "They raise meat as we raise wheat. They eat meat as we eat bread. How can we fight that?" If the farms had been shocking, the next revelation crushed the last illusions of parity. The prisoners assigned to labor near food distribution centers saw for the first time the machinery that made abundance possible. Vast warehouses rose from the plains, brick fortresses humming with the constant vibration of compressors. Inside, the air bit cold, their breath visible in clouds. It was here that they discovered America's hidden weapon, refrigeration. Germany, by 1943, had no such scale. Cold storage facilities were small, scattered, and vulnerable to Allied bombing. Meat had to be eaten quickly or salted until it was tough as leather. In America, by contrast, enormous rooms stretched like cathedrals, stacked with carcasses hanging from steel hooks, kept fresh by refrigeration systems powered by electricity that seemed endless. Prisoners shivered as guards walked them through the corridors. One later recalled, "It was as though they had captured winter and stored it in buildings. We fought hunger, they fought with ice." The prisoners learned that fleets of refrigerated trucks, each loaded with fresh beef, moved daily from these warehouses to towns, bases, and ports. The numbers staggered them. Each truck carried more than a week of rations for a German battalion. Hundreds of trucks rolled out every morning, returning by nightfall for new loads. And these were only a fraction of the convoys feeding the nation and the armies abroad. Then came the statistics, whispered by guards or overheard from American supervisors. In the years of the war, the United States produced over 5 billion pounds of Spam alone, the canned meat that became legendary among Allied troops. Factories worked around the clock, churning out tins that could cross oceans without spoiling. To the prisoners, Spam became a symbol of American supremacy, not glamorous, not heroic, but inexhaustible. One German officer admitted bitterly, "We could not defeat a nation that can entire armies." The refrigeration plants did more than preserve meat. They represented an industrial miracle beyond German comprehension. Machines sliced, packaged, and sealed food with assembly line precision. Conveyor belts carried carcasses past workers who trimmed and cut with practiced speed, while automatic fillers poured meat into tins at rates no human butcher could match. A prisoner who had once worked at a small abattoir in Frankfurt shook his head as he watched. "We slaughter by hand," he murmured. Even more devastating was the casual relationship Americans had with surplus. To maintain market stability, vast amounts of fruit and meat were sometimes destroyed rather than sold at a loss. Prisoners witnessed mountains of oranges bulldozed into pits, hogs slaughtered not for hunger, but for price control. To men raised in scarcity, it felt obscene. They begged guards to let them send discarded food to their starving families in Germany. The guards, sympathetic but powerless, explained that it was impossible. The waste was strategic, not careless. America had so much that it had to regulate abundance. The psychological blow was immense. One diary entry read, "In Germany, we scrape pans for the last drop of fat. In America, they pour rivers of milk into the ground. We hunger. They drowned in plenty," another noted bitterly. "They have found ways to waste food scientifically. We cannot even feed our children." As days turned to weeks, the Germans began to grasp the larger picture. It was not simply that America produced more. It was that America had built an entire infrastructure: farms, slaughterhouses, canneries, refrigerated warehouses, fleets of trucks and ships that multiplied production and guaranteed delivery anywhere in the world. This was not improvisation. It was an industrial system designed for infinity. The realization spread through the camps like a slow contagion. Every plate of beef, every truckload of meat, every can of Spam reinforced the same truth. They were fighting a nation whose weakest weapon was abundance. America had weaponized food as surely as it had tanks and bombers. The prisoners could feel it in their stomachs, full for the first time in years, and in their hearts, hollow with the knowledge that no courage or discipline could overcome such disparity. One evening, after unloading crates of meat into a cold storage depot, a German lieutenant leaned against the wall and confessed to his comrades, "We thought the war would be decided by panzers and Stukas. But here, in these warehouses, I see the real battlefield. We have already lost." The numbers told a story more brutal than bullets. Prisoners began to compare what they ate in captivity with what their families described in letters from Germany. The contrast was staggering. In 1944, the average German civilian received less than 30 pounds of meat in an entire year. By then, children were fainting in schools. Mothers traded heirlooms for sausages on the black market, and fathers returned from the front to find their families gaunt and hollow-eyed. Meanwhile, in the United States, official figures showed each citizen consuming more than 150 pounds of meat annually. For an American soldier, the daily ration often included nearly 2 pounds of beef, pork, or poultry, not counting eggs, milk, and butter. The Germans at the camps calculated what this meant. A single American soldier ate in one day what a German soldier received in a week. A single state like Iowa produced more pork than the entire Reich. Spam alone accounted for billions of pounds, enough to feed not only American troops, but also British, Soviet, and Pacific allies. The prisoners realized that their armies had not been beaten only by men with rifles, but by the factories, farms, and canneries behind them. At the mess halls, the disparity played out every night. Trays loaded with meat, potatoes, bread, and butter circulated endlessly. Some Germans began leaving food uneaten, not from ingratitude but from sheer inability to stomach so much. The guards collected the leftovers and tipped them into bins, which pigs from nearby farms devoured. Prisoners watched in silence, thinking of wives and children back home who boiled nettles for soup. One man whispered, "Our children starve, and here pigs eat better than them." The numbers haunted them. Germany's total wartime meat supply could not match what America exported overseas. While German rations shrank year after year, America increased its production despite fighting on two oceans. The mathematics of logistics crushed morale. Even if German soldiers had won victories in North Africa or Russia, what then? Their armies would still have faced starvation. America, by contrast, could fight indefinitely without hunger ever touching its men. Letters smuggled through the camp revealed more despair. One prisoner wrote, "I fear telling my wife how well we eat. She writes that she has not tasted butter in 2 years. How could she understand that her husband, a captive, dines better than she?" Another confessed, "I feel shame when I am full. My children at home are thin as sticks." These words spread among the men, heavy as the sound of chains. Some tried to rationalize it. They argued that perhaps America was rich now, but would grow tired of war. Others shook their heads, pointing to the trains of cattle, the warehouses of frozen meat, the convoys of ships leaving every harbor. "They cannot run out," one officer said flatly. "They have more food than we have people." By the end of 1944, the psychological shift was complete. The prisoners no longer spoke of Germany's ultimate victory. They had seen too much, eaten too well, counted too many statistics. They understood that war was not decided by courage alone. It was decided by calories, by trains, by refrigerated trucks, by the simple arithmetic of production. And by every measure, Germany was already bankrupt. By the winter of 1944, the German prisoners in Texas no longer argued about the war's outcome. At first, they had whispered in secret that Hitler might unleash a new weapon, that the Reich would rally and strike back. But after months of eating American food, seeing American farms, and working among American machines, the whispers turned into silence. What they had witnessed was not just abundance, it was a different kind of war, one their country could never hope to fight. Every meal in the camp became a reminder. The clatter of trays, the smell of roast beef, the sight of white bread and butter, it all weighed heavier than barbed wire or armed guards. It told them daily that America possessed more than Germany could imagine. They were prisoners not only of war, but of mathematics. Each plate of food, each loaf of bread, each can of Spam was an equation Germany could not solve. A German officer once muttered over his coffee, "Our people march in darkness. Here, even prisoners live in light." His comrades nodded, no one daring to contradict. The despair grew sharper with letters from home. Families wrote of bombed-out neighborhoods, ration cards that yielded nothing, children surviving on thin soup. Some letters begged for food, not knowing their husbands in captivity were eating meat twice a day. The guilt gnawed at them worse than hunger ever had. One prisoner wrote secretly in his diary, "I cannot tell my wife. How could she understand that her husband, a captive, eats like a king while she starves. The realization spread like a slow sickness. If America could feed its prisoners with meat, milk, and eggs, what then did it provide for its own soldiers? If German civilians could not find butter, yet American pigs ate table scraps, what chance did the Reich truly have? In the barracks at night, men confessed the thought none would have dared in Africa. The war was over long before they were captured. It had been lost, not in the desert, not in Russia, not in the skies above Berlin, but in the unseen fields and factories of America. Some describe the psychological collapse as worse than defeat in battle. Battle gave at least the dignity of resistance. Abundance gave nothing but humiliation. To realize that your enemy wastes casually what your family craves desperately, this was a wound that never healed. Years later, many prisoners remembered not the guards or the fences, but the garbage bins overflowing with uneaten food. They recalled the sight of American children tossing away sandwiches, of farm dogs gnawing meat their own children would never taste. In their diaries, the same phrase returned again and again. They eat meat like bread. That is why we lost. When the war finally ended in 1945, many of these prisoners returned to a ruined Germany. They stepped into cities flattened by bombs, streets lined with the hungry and the homeless, shops empty but for dust. Yet in their minds they carried the images of Texas, the endless cattle, the warehouses of frozen meat, the trains of refrigerated cars, the mess hall trays piled high. They told their families in quiet voices what they had seen, though often the truth seemed unbelievable. How could America have so much when Germany had so little? For the men who lived through it, captivity had delivered the final lesson of the war. Tanks and planes might win battles, but wars were won in the factories, the fields, and the farms. Germany had gambled everything on speed, surprise, and discipline. America had answered with sheer abundance. And in the end, abundance proved stronger than any army,